Hello and welcome everyone to today's event. My name is Nadia Lali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown University, where I'm professor of anthropology and Middle East studies. It's my great pleasure to host today's event. I've invited Professor Sumayya Kassamali, and we'll be speaking about her work on female domestic labor in Beirut, reflections on race and gender. And this talk is part of a series on exploring the questions of race and racialization in the context of the Middle East and its diaspora, which we started last year. But it also, of course, addresses issues of gender, which has been central to the kind of work we do at the center. So welcome, Sumayya. It's wonderful to be with you today. I actually read one of your articles in my new course on gendering migration and diaspora this semester and enjoyed it very much, and so did the students. And I thought I need to be in conversation with you. So I'm so glad it worked out. Let me introduce Sumayya. Professor Sumayya Kassamali is assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. Her research examines the intersections of migration, neoliberalism, and racialization in the Middle East, and the transformation of social relations that accompanied the arrival of African and Asian migrant domestic workers to post-war Lebanon. Her current project, entitled Black Beirut, focuses on the urban afterlife of precarious labor migration, as it has created new forms of language, intimacy, and belonging in the city of Beirut. So the structure of event will be that Sumayya and myself will be in conversation for about 40 minutes or so. And I encourage you to put your comments and questions in the Q&A function, and we'll have some time, 20 minutes or so, or even longer if you have many questions towards the end. So Sumayya, I think it is important for those in the audience who are not familiar with some of the sort of legal political framework of migration to give an introduction into the kafala system, because that is the key of actually circumscribing relations between domestic labor and their employees in Lebanon, as in the Gulf countries and other countries in the region. So can you introduce the kafala system to us, please?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for attending. I'm happy to be able to present my research. And I'm actually really glad to start with this question, because one of the things that I've been trying to do in my work is to redefine the kafala system away from its common translation, which is using the word sponsorship. So the standard definition of the kafala system is as a regional or a Middle East specific sponsorship system that governs migrant labor, which is to say determines the institutional regulation and management of temporary foreign labor in most of the Arabic-speaking countries surrounding the Persian Gulf. So usually the GCC countries, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. But Iraq and Yemen have aspects of the kafala system. They're not usually included in that list, as well as Jordan and Lebanon. So in all of these countries, a foreign worker's residence or work permit is directly tied to a sponsor or a kafil, and there is no parallel mechanism for immigration in the way we might be familiar with in the North American context. So even elite foreigners are subject to the requirement of having either an individual citizen or a proxy, such as a business, serve as their sponsor. Now, another way this has been described is as the privatization of immigration, or the outsourcing of labor migration from the state to the citizenry. So the first thing I want to say is that this is the biggest difference between the kafala system and some of the other many guest worker programs around the world. Now, although a lot of the news coverage makes the kafala system seem singularly exploitative, I want to point out that almost all of these global guest worker programs, including those in Canada where I live, include a mixture of prior screening, temporary work visas with limited or no access to naturalization, strict restrictions on employment, mobility, and political organizing, as well as precarious working conditions and racialized targeting and discrimination. But what distinguishes the kafala system is that it places almost all responsibility for these foreign workers in the hands of the sponsors, meaning citizens, individual citizens or businesses, and not the state. And sometimes you can have elite non-citizens, let's say professors visiting, working in a country, they can also sponsor a migrant worker. So in my work as an anthropologist, I draw upon the insights of theorists who show us how privatization is not only a set of economic policies or legal regulations, but also a social logic. And I think that it's not quite accurate to define the kafala system as just a sponsorship system, because this assumes that everything we need to know about kafala is contained in the dynamics of sponsor and sponsored, i.e. employer and employee, or even citizen and foreigner. In fact, the kafala system is a large-scale social institution that can be found in every aspect of the societies where it operates. So for example, in the Lebanese context, I look at how construction regulations have changed to accommodate the architecture of what is called the maid's room, ghurfat al-khadimah. I look at the proliferation of domestic workers as characters in TV and film and literature, the rise of new social categories such as the madam, the proliferation of stereotypes about how Sri Lankan women smell, or Ethiopian women speak Arabic, or Bangladeshi women are obsessed with gold. I also look at patterns of behavior specifically tied to the experience of domestic work, such as consistent ways in which women are abused by depriving them of food or forcibly cutting off their hair, as well as strategies of resistance and communication among domestic workers incarcerated in private homes. Even things like this genre of salon talk, where Lebanese women frequently compare their domestic workers to each other while they're getting their hair and nails done. So I think it's essential that we understand all of this as part of the kafala system, which constitutes an enormous, multifaceted social institution with both formal and informal elements that is far more than just sponsorship. I hope that's
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I mean, that's a much more comprehensive and holistic approach to the system, because as you say, that's it is often defined in this very sort of simplistic way of the sponsorship system. And often, I mean, most of the literature that I'm familiar with looks at it in the context of Gulf countries. You've already hinted at it a bit, but can you tell us a bit more about the specificities and the specific history of the Lebanese context and how kafala has emerged in Lebanon from previous arrangements, and what is, if anything, unique to the Lebanese kafala system?
Yeah, my apologies in advance. My answer to this question is very long, but I'll do my best. So I think many people in the audience will know that recently there's been some really important research done to challenge the assumption that the kafala system emerges only after the expansion of the arrival and the expansion of the oil industry in the Gulf. So I'm thinking of Omar al-Shahabi's recent work connecting the kafala system with British colonial practices that sought to control labor migration in the pearl industry in Bahrain and then expanded elsewhere. So he's looked at Bahrain and Kuwait. But it's true that generally speaking, the kafala system and what is referred to as the Asianization of the workforce in the Gulf countries starting from the 1970s, was a joint product of the growth of the oil industry. So of course, 1973 with OPEC, you have the enormous inflation of oil profits in the region, as well as specific histories of labor mobilizations in the Gulf. So it's important to remember that during the 1950s and the 1960s, Arab workers in the Gulf, you had Egyptians, Palestinians, you had workers from, in fact, all over the region, Yemeni, were highly politicized and were making demands as organized labor and also seeking to settle their families in the area. Adam Hania, who's at SOAS, has done some essential research on how these labor mobilizations, the strikes, the demands that workers were making, and also the idea that Arab workers, politicized by the general climate of pan-Arabism and Nasserism, saw themselves as active those who belong in the Gulf and those who could make claims on what it means to live in the region and work in the region. And that this formed the backdrop for a shift to what we have today, which are both increasingly narrow definitions of citizenship throughout the Gulf. So you have the rise of new citizenship laws that have very strict definitions of who is a citizen and who is not, as well as a shift towards largely South Asian labor, who were seen as less able to be politicized. There was less linguistic and cultural familiarity. They were less confident and organized in terms of making demands. So this is the backdrop, and it's important to keep this labor history together with the oil industry, which is expanding in the 70s at the same time. Now, Lebanon is quite different for a number of reasons. First, it has historically been Syrians who filled the construction industry, as well as certain other manual labor workforces, including the agricultural and industrial sectors. And then after 1948 and 67, they were of course joined by large numbers of Palestinians. Now, again, I'm sure many in the audience will know about how notoriously messy the institution that we call the Lebanese state is. So the way the kafala system works in Lebanon is often more blurry than in the Gulf, given the presence of what can be thought of as a weak state in Lebanon compared to the strong states of the Gulf. So, for example, not only do both male and female African and Asian migrant workers fall under the requirements of sponsorship that we said characterize the kafala system, but recently, Syrian refugees have also been subject to certain aspects of the kafala system, including the requirement of having a Lebanese sponsor in some situations. So it depends if you're registered with the UN as a refugee, it depends if you're there as a student versus a worker. There's a series of qualifiers. Lebanon also has smaller but not insignificant communities of Egyptian workers, as well as Sudanese and Iraqi refugees, all of whom exist in what I think of as a kind of vague tangential proximity to what gets called kafala. But generally speaking, and again, I apologize for this overly complicated set of qualifiers, the kafala system refers specifically to African and Asian women, self-identified as women, who work as migrant domestic labor and who make up the majority of the non-regional foreign workforce, i.e. non-Palestinian or non-Syrian. And a note about terminology, I sometimes say non-Arab, but of course you have many Syrian Kurds as well, so it's a bit of a slippery game of identification. And that's also why I generally prefer African and Asian as an identifier, although that leaves the issue of North Africa and the presence of Egyptian, but also in the sex work industry, there's historically been the presence of North African women in Lebanon. Also, it's mostly Eastern European now. So again, there's this kind of conglomeration of identifiers, but nonetheless, the kafala system, for the most part, quantitatively and discursively, refers to African and Asian migrant domestic workers. So in terms of the question about earlier patterns and how we get to this demographic shift, when it comes to domestic work, there is a long local history of upper class households in the region, in Bilad al-Sham, broadly speaking, relying on outside help to perform domestic labor that stretches back to Ottoman times. This was a relatively small and elite phenomenon consisting mostly of young women, sometimes even girls as young as 7 or 8 years old who would be adopted as daughters, sort of, who would also then work, from Palestinian, Syrian, Kurdish, and working class Lebanese backgrounds. And we have to remember that these distinctions between Lebanon and Syria are obviously a lot blurrier before the modern nation states, who would sometimes pass through the families of wealthier families, the homes of wealthy families, for a brief period of time. They would get certain kinds of class training. Let's say they would learn to read and write Arabic, learn poetry, learn sewing, house domestic skills, and then they would go on to get married. And other times they would remain with families across multiple generations. So they would never marry, they would kind of be incorporated into the family in some way. It's referred to as fictive kinship. Some of them, will be, and they'll inherit from these families, they'll be buried on family properties. There's a mixture of arrangements, but they don't take the form of traditional wage labor for the most part. So we have stories in the early 1900s of village brokers who would recruit the daughters of poor families in the countryside to work in the homes of wealthy families. You have a lot of these mediating figures. And Elizabeth Thompson, in her History of the Mandate Period, records over 20,000 peasant girls and young women working in the homes of wealthy families in Beirut and Damascus in the 1920s. In fact, Leila Fawaz has this really interesting interview with a woman who she records the woman saying that as late as the 1960s, Druze and Christian women in Lebanon would refuse to work in factories or hospitals in Beirut, leaving such unrespectable jobs for the Kurds and the Shia, but they preferred the socially acceptable status of working as domestic help in the homes of wealthy Christian families. So again, it's also interlaid with these sectarian dynamics that we identify with the Lebanese social context. Now, the big shift, so again, the prehistory of the kafala system is you have a majority of Arab and Kurdish, Syrian, Lebanese, Egyptian, mostly working class and peasant women and girls, young women and girls who are doing the work of domestic labor in the homes of wealthier families. Now, the big shift in Lebanon happens during the Civil War, which lasts from 1975 to 1990. During the war, these women, Egyptian, Palestinian, Syrian, and other workers, either fled the country or were expelled from certain regions and neighborhoods due to their affiliation with factions implicated in the war. So you have some really interesting work done on the mass expulsion of Syrians, for example, from Christian-dominated neighborhoods, because the history of the Lebanese Civil War is also the history of the kind of redrawing geographic boundaries of who lives in what neighborhood and what kind of militias end up having control over different neighborhoods. You have these incredible stories of families where Palestinian women would be working as domestic workers, and if they were mistreated, they would say, I'm going to call the Fedayeen on you, or I'm going to call the guerrilla factions to kind of back me up. And so there are stories of Lebanese families saying that we got really scared of the Palestinians during the war, and so that's why we didn't want them in our homes anymore. Now, at the same time, approximately 40% of the Lebanese population left the country during the war, over this 15-year period of the war. And outside of Lebanon, global economic crises in the 1970s led to a number of Asian countries, particularly the Philippines and Sri Lanka, introducing policies aimed at exporting their female labor force in order to reduce unemployment and increase national remittances. So, economists and sociologists refer to this as the push and pull factor. You have a series of factors that are specific to Lebanon, and the Middle East scholarship tends to focus on only regional issues, but we have to also think about what's happening in the countries that are referred to as the exporting countries or the sending countries. And at that time, you have the rise of the idea of the woman who sacrifices herself for her country. So especially in the Philippines, there is a whole national discourse that rises about women who leave their families behind, and the husbands care for the children, and they travel abroad, care for other families to send remittances back to kind of be the financial support of the country. Okay, so it's during the Civil War in Lebanon that enterprising recruitment agencies, basically kind of entrepreneurial business figures, took advantage of an absence of government regulation and this breakdown in pre-existing patterns of social trust in order to bring migrant women, African and Asian women, into the country as domestic workers. Now, the last piece of this puzzle is that there's also an extremely important connection with the Gulf, because you have a large number of Lebanese workers who leave during the war and go to the Gulf, and then after they return to Lebanon. And many return either with domestic workers who they themselves had hired while in especially Saudi Arabia, but these are wealthier Lebanese families who go to the Gulf, they enter these kafala system kind of arrangements. And others don't return with domestic workers, but they return with certain ideas about gendered and racialized labor, the desirability and prestige of having a domestic worker, the idea that it's not good to do this kind of demeaning work of cleaning and cooking and raising children and taking care of old people. You should outsource that. And the infrastructure of the kafala system. So I just want to mention that there's really essential historical work to be done about the connections between Lebanon and the Gulf, specifically Saudi Arabia, in the early development of the kafala system during the Civil War, that I would love for someone to do in case there's anyone out there looking for a project. You know, as a historian, it would be amazing for this work to happen.
Right. Gosh, Sumayya, I mean, I have to admit that I hadn't realized when I would pose this question that there is such a comprehensive answer, but I understand there are so many different layers and pieces to the puzzle, and you beautifully laid them out to us. So thanks. I have a much better understanding now about the complexities and the history. Now you stress that it is really female African and Asian migrant domestic workers that are associated with the kafala system. However, I also understand, and I understand that from having read your work, but also having been to Beirut many times, that when people speak about their female domestic labor, they tend to use the term Sri Lanka, which literally means Sri Lankan. And they use the term to refer to all migrant domestic workers. So, I mean, one of the things that I found so interesting in your work is that you attempt to illustrate the racialization of the migrant domestic worker that underlines the contemporary kafala system. So can you elaborate on the meaning of race in the kafala system in Lebanon?
Yeah, I can do my best. So, you know, I wish there was an easy answer to this question, but one of the things that I have learned and that I'm trying to think through and write through is that there is no simple framework by which we can isolate the category of race from the way it's situated in this intersectional category of the migrant domestic worker. So a category that is, of course, gendered, racialized, and class, to use that classic feminist framework of intersectionality, gender, race, and class, but also further tied up with the legal infrastructure of foreignness. And this category of foreignness, I think, is really central to also understanding, you know, what is happening when it comes to the experiences of migrant workers. And foreignness in the Lebanese context, like this term ajanib, the Arabic term for foreign workers is omad al-ajanib, but then there's, of course, the term domestic workers, amilat al-manazil, which is a gendered term. But foreignness is a word, some of the legal infrastructure of dispossessing Palestinians from the right to work certain jobs, for example, is also under this legal category of foreigner. So it has this both legal and political relevance in that context. So you have gender, race, and class, you have foreignness, you have the precarity and exploitability of being a worker inside the home specifically. And you also have a category that is internally differentiated by a set of national stereotypes about different countries of origin. So what it means to be Ethiopian versus Filipina versus Sri Lankan. Now, as you know, the question of race is a really current topic in Middle East studies. And as part of this conversation, I've seen many people point to the kafala system as a kind of key example, a paradigmatic instance of anti-Blackness in the region, one that is often further linked to the regional histories of slavery and conquest. So there's often a connection made between the contemporary kafala system and the history of what's called the Islamic or the Arab slave trade. But of course, Blackness and racial categories more broadly are not stable signifiers. We know that they shift over time and within contexts, both in terms of what kind of words are used to create new racial hierarchies and categories, but also what possibilities of life are entailed or foreclosed within these categories. So, for example, one of the things that I found really striking is that in some of the literature on the presence of the earlier presence of female Ethiopian domestic workers in 18th and 19th century Ottoman context, both enslaved, and free, they are often described as prized for their remarkable beauty. So this is a way in which, you know, the historiography of the late Ottoman slave trade, these are one of the ways in which Ethiopian women are identified. And this really struck me because a lot of the contemporary discourse in Lebanon is permeated with a kind of disgust at the bodies of Ethiopian and other women, African and Asian women, for whom beauty is an almost unfathomable description, unless it's part of an objectifying fetishization. So you have this famous incident in Lebanon of a feminist NGO named Kafa making a fake soap allegedly to clean domestic workers' bodies. And they had a whole campaign around this fake soap, and they intended to draw attention to problematic racial stereotypes about uncleanliness or dirt or hygiene through this campaign and this fake invention. But it was so socially believable that the Lebanese Ministry of Labor actually thought it was real and issued a statement calling on people not to buy this soap. So this is just to contrast. Now, when we read in the historiography that Ethiopian women were prized for their beauty, of course, there is a difference between that kind of blanket statement and the experiences of these women. But even at the level of discourse, there's such a significant difference between what these bodies mean and how they're apprehended and discussed. To take another very straightforward example, friends with certain shades of brown or black skin, but American or European passports in Beirut might simultaneously be subject to certain kinds of racial insults walking on the streets of Lebanon, but also deeply protected from the violence of the state when it comes to things like processing visas. So if you go to the ministry where you have to do paperwork, there's a very different experience for them, or for us even, versus people who are migrant domestic workers who don't have their passports, who have a whole form of racialized legal discrimination that they're subject to. So for me, the most important thing to understand in relation to this question about race and the kafala system is that in only 3 decades, really, we're talking about a system that proliferates in the 1990s. That's when it really becomes a wide-scale social phenomenon after the war, with all the money coming into Lebanon for reconstruction, and what's referred to as a kind of post-war neoliberalism. In only 3+ decades, the kafala system has introduced this new social category of the migrant domestic worker, or what we could say, using Cedric Robinson's term, are new hierarchies of human worth. And that's where you get this term Sri Lankiya. So it's not the only word used for domestic workers. The term, again, it's the Arabic adjective for female Sri Lankan. It's a national adjective, the way American, etc. would be, but it's gendered as feminine. But it's become possible because Sri Lanka was the first major country of origin for domestic workers. That term came to signify this entire category of migrant domestic worker. That term coexists with a lot of other terms, such as the English word, in English they would be maid, helper, domestic worker, servant. These are all words that can be used, but this is a specific one. And you can even say, and you hear sentences such as, my Sri Lankiya is from the Philippines. So I should note that this term is further objectified by using the possessive so that you can say yours or mine about this person. And to me, this term is the closest thing in the Lebanese context to how people use Black in the North American context, or at least how we think of Black as a racial category. Not that they are synonyms, but that they are distinctive social categories that contain within them the complex histories marked by a distinctive form of vulnerability to death. And this is using Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism. She says racism is marked by a distinctive or a particular vulnerability and proximity to the experience of death. But the last thing I want to say is that it's important to point out that all the deep histories of slavery in the North American context and the relationship of Blackness to freedom and struggle that so many people are writing about these days has an extremely different trajectory in Lebanon. And I wonder if whether in 100 years we might see a very different meaning to the term Sri Lankiya, but as it currently stands, it's a very fixed category with very specific structural constraints tied to the kafala system. Although, as always, there is immense creativity within these constraints. But compared to how we think about Blackness, it's far more narrow in terms of its ties to the kafala system.
Yeah, thank you. I'm listening to you. I'm wondering, so what does it say about Lebanese self-understandings in terms of race? I mean, one of the things that has struck me a lot when in conversation with some, not all, of course, Lebanese. I mean, there's lots of diversity, of course, and not just not only in sectarian terms and class and gender, but I guess also in terms of, politics and ideas. But, one of the things that has struck me is often the sort of insistence of, not being Arab and, pointing to the specific Phoenician past. And so so you're speaking about, some parallel in terms of Sri Lanka and the concept of blackness in the US. What about concepts of whiteness and white supremacy? How do they play out, especially in the context of also this construction of, again, amongst some Lebanese, of not wanting to be Arab as well?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think it's one important part of the puzzle. Again, kind of like the question about the history of the kafala system in Lebanon, I think that there are multiple genealogies through which we can begin to form answers to this question. But again, there isn't enough adequate historical work to give us a strong enough picture. So, for example, there is this connection between fascist and Aryan white supremacist ideology from Europe, specifically Italy, Spain, and Nazi Germany in the mid-20th century in the context of the Kataib Party, which is a sort of political, religious, formerly a political party that was a major presence in the Civil War and still exists. So, that's one line through which we can draw a local thread, a local history. There are sets of ideas about what it means to be Lebanese that come from people like Michel Chiha and the founding ideologues of Lebanese nationalism, often, as you just pointed out for us, formulated in opposition to being Syrian or Muslim or Arab. So the idea that Lebanon and Lebanese-ness or Lebanese identity is constituted against the Syrian Muslim Arab identity or broader regional context. There is also the important history of European and American influence in the so-called golden years of Beirut, this whole the Paris of the Middle East image that Beirut had attained at that time around the 50s, as well as the equally, if not more important history of anti-colonial sentiments in the region, particularly through the Palestinian Revolution and the importance of Beirut as a node of African and Asian solidarity and third world internationalism. So one of the anecdotes I like to say is that there used to be an Ethiopian Students Association in Lebanon around the 60s, and there was a very large presence of African students and political ideologues, anti-colonial intellectuals, poets, writers who were passing through Beirut, which is, again, it's an unfathomable reality in the contemporary, even pre-2019, demographic and social landscape of Lebanon. But this is a very recent history. And so I think all of these things are part of those threads through which we think about what whiteness and blackness look like in this specific context. So, of course, there is a basic level of racial thinking present in Lebanese society, one that apprehends a relationship between skin color and value. Again, this concept of hierarchies of human worth. But I would not go so far as to simply say that Lebanon is anti-Black or white supremacist. I think that these terms, the English terms anti-Black and white supremacist, are deeply laden with the particular history of the transatlantic slave trade. And we first need to do this careful historic work of teasing out the various strands of how local and regionally specific categories come into being and are also contested. So I know you had Eve Trout-Powell speak as part of this series, and I think her work is such an important example of the kind of work that needs to be done in Lebanon and throughout the region. And one last example that, again, I find interesting is the word asmar or samra, which is, of course, the word for the color brown, but it's also used to describe a great tan. And it's a word associated with feminine beauty in a lot of music, a lot of Arabic music that I would hear while living in Beirut. And Lebanon in the summers is full of billboards advertising tanning and people wanting to spend time at the beach to bronze their skin. At the same time, most private beaches forbid domestic workers from entering the water or wearing bathing suits because of these violently racist assumptions, associations with their bodies and their skin color. So I wonder how we talk about brownness and blackness and whiteness, trying to keep at play all of these locally specific experiences. And I find, the best way to do it, obviously, as an anthropologist, I think, is that we start from stories of actual life, as opposed to from the somewhat, not abstract, but the historically specific terms, such as white supremacy, that I worry carry too much of the connotations of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, thank you. Sumayya, before I'm going to ask next question, which I'm going to shift gear a bit, I would like to encourage the audience again to put in their questions and comments in the Q&A function. So my next question revolves around the specific kind of work that female domestic workers do. I mean, they don't do just any type of work. I mean, they do care work. And what are, if any, what are specific implications of care work here?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, because this category of care work is also something that I'm wondering about and thinking through, and have been for some time. And sometimes I worry that the category can risk exceptionalizing this kind of labor, as if all forms of labor are not laden with affect and care and permeated by gendered and racialized dynamics, as we know about teaching in the academy, for example. So increasingly, I feel that work, the category of work, is somewhat inadequate to encapsulate the dynamics of what it is like to be inside the kafala system. So again, let me give you an example. There's this extremely common and horrifying practice in Lebanon where, when a domestic worker runs away from the home of her sponsor, so the sponsor being the employer, usually a family member, usually the woman, in fact, but there are a fair number of men who serve as the legal sponsor, even though the woman, the wife or the mother of the household, tends to be the one who interacts most with the domestic worker. So the sponsor will not only report to the police that she has fled, and just to clarify, it's very, very common for women to run away just because of mistreatment and a series of other reasons. The sponsor will report to the police that she has fled, but also include a false allegation of theft. Commonly, they will say she stole a large amount of cash or valuables such as gold. And it is widely known that the police encourage this kind of false accusation because running away is not a criminal offense, but theft is. And what that means is that, eventually, so you have all these women running away, and they're undocumented workers, the way we understand that category, again, in a city like New York, where undocumented labor does so much of the day-to-day operations of the city. So they are at risk for deportation, but it's often the case that women will intentionally give themselves up to police for deportation. Like, they'll go to a checkpoint and basically ask to be taken to prison. It has a term, it's called بتسلم حالك, to give yourself up. And it's because that's the easiest way to travel, to get back home. So you spend a chunk of time in the detention center, you pay a penalty, and you usually pay the cost of your ticket back home, and you get yourself deported. So if there is a false theft accusation on the woman's file under her name, before she can leave the country, she has to resolve the theft complaint in court, or more likely through bribes or backdoor channels. So basically, it's a way to get money. And this practice is referred to in employer parlance as retrieving your investment. So employers usually spend between $1,500 to up to $5,000 hiring a domestic worker, all the fees and a series of broker fees and ticket costs and medical insurance that you have to pay to bring someone to your home. This is considered an investment, and the idea is that when they run away, you've lost your investment. And so there should be a way to get it back. You're kind of entitled to that money. So it strikes me that conceiving of the domestic worker as an investment is not at all the same of conceiving of them as a form of labor or a relation of employment. And there's some interesting scholarship that has been done about how work might not be the right category for domestic labor or domestic work, because what is actually demanded is the entire person, a kind of complete subjection and subjugation. I refer to this as the attempt to strip someone of her socio-political being and remake her in servitude. And again, I look at these examples of how domestic workers, their names are often changed. So they'll just be referred to as a different name, either a short form of their name because their name is too complicated to say, or the name of the last domestic worker that they had because they had memorized that name. So it's like their entire person is demanded, and they want to kind of remake the domestic worker into a different kind of subject, a subject that is a servant. I think through Judith Butler and Foucault and this notion of subjectivization, which is a little bit different than the category of employment or affective labor or care work. And again, this is not the same as enslavement, but it is a resonant form of unfreedom that we can see in the way domestic work and the kafala system operates.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I also really like the point you make about, I mean, that the way the literature looks at care work is often very narrowly defined. And of course, there's, as you say, the care aspect and affective aspect that extends to lots of different forms of work. I had a question about the working conditions and forms of exploitation, but I see there is a question here from the audience, so I'm going to take that first. It's from my friend Georgina Manok. Hello, Georgina. So Georgina is asking, do you see any connection between Maronite supremacy and the racialized hierarchy of migrant workers from the Philippines in Lebanon? And do you think the current financial collapse might impact the racialized hierarchy when more Lebanese are engaged in domestic labor?
Yeah, thank you. Two really interesting questions. In terms of the first question, maybe for audience members that aren't aware, there is this internal, again, racialized hierarchy where there's this phrase about Filipina women where they're referred to as the Mercedes-Benz of servants. And it's tied to shade of skin, but also things like language. So it's very common that if you want a domestic worker who will be able to help your children with homework, for example, in wealthier families, especially if they're doing English language education, you might want a Filipina woman because she's understood to be fluent in English, just because of the history of the U.S. colonization of Philippines, etc. And it's true that there is, again, this complex hierarchy of who's at the top of the ladder of domestic work. But one of the things that I've realized is that, when you look at stories of abuse, actually that hierarchy is not sustainable in that you have women from all contexts of origin who are subject to very similar practices. So in terms of the point about forms of exploitation, deprivation of food, rest, mobility, a kind of incarceration in the home. Amnesty International calls it the house as a prison. And they draw that phrase from women who they met. And I heard that kind of phrase all the time, that the house is a prison, it traps us. And there is no statistical majority where women from X country are treated vastly worse. You have many, many Filipino women, for example, who are subject to these practices. And on the reverse side, in terms of Maronite, you also don't have clear information about some sectarian communities in Lebanon treating their domestic workers worse than others. I actually think of the kafala system as one of the most cross-sectarian institutions in Lebanese society. People participate in it across every sectarian demographic, and from the elite into the lower middle class context. You even have, wealthier Palestinian families who live in refugee camps, but have the capital to employ a migrant domestic worker. And often the wages they're paying are so minimal that it's not beyond their reach. And so I don't think there is a unique distinction between either the mistreatment or better treatment of Filipino women or a unique form of racism particular to Maronite or other sectarian demographics. Although, like I said, because of the history of the Kataib Party, that is a place where white supremacist ideology has really found root in Lebanese ideology or ideologies present in Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of the second question, it's really interesting. So yeah, you have suddenly, it's become common, or at least not entirely uncommon, for Lebanese people to work as domestic workers in the context of the crisis. And there have been some reports about how there's so much shame associated with it, and many people don't want to admit that they're doing this work that has been reserved, discursively, imaginatively reserved for foreigners. It's not that you had zero Lebanese domestic workers. You did have some who, again, are holdouts from an earlier era and who are still alive, but they're definitely towards the end of their service and their life. And so you now have this new phenomenon. Part of me does think that, yes, in the long scheme, in the long arc of history, the redrawing of what labor looks like in the post-crisis Lebanon, and these hierarchies of human worth being somewhat destabilized and made messier, that has the potential to change things. But the situation in Lebanon is so devastating right now that I don't think I can be concretely hopeful. But I think maybe if we think in kind of a 50-year arc, there could be something that changes. But it depends a lot on, what becomes possible in Lebanon in the context of this crisis. And right now it does feel quite bleak.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I guess it's quite early to sort of be able to tell. Also, it's quite unsure where things are going in this, really acute crisis. I've been wondering, so during my visits to Beirut, especially, trying to be in conversation with young Lebanese feminists, particularly queer feminists, what struck me was, the way that intersectionality played out in that context. And I found that there were several queer feminist activists and also feminist activists and organizations that seemed to be in solidarity and be involved in solidarity activism with domestic migrant workers organizations. So I guess I have two questions here. One, sort of going back a bit. So, you're describing the kafala system, you're describing, these horrendous working conditions. And so I guess on one level, I'm interested. So what do people say about it, or what are some of the different narratives around these working conditions amongst Lebanese society? And secondly, are you aware of these solidarity activities? And I don't know if you've had a chance to speak to female domestic labor, what they think about those Lebanese who are actually, trying to challenge the existing system.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'll start with the second one. So in the last decade, there's been an enormous increase in attention to this issue on the part of NGOs, news organizations, both local and international, and especially through these collaborations that you're mentioning among local activists. So the group that has been at the forefront of this is something called the Antiracism Movement, or ARM. It's a kind of umbrella organization that brings together a number of different people, but it really started as a collaboration between migrant community leaders, so people who had been in the country for a long time and were already either informally or through connections with embassies, service providers. They were providing all sorts of aid and help and shelter for migrant workers, both male and female, but especially domestic workers who have been mistreated. And many of those figures who had been in Lebanon for 10, 20, even more years, were very fluent in how to navigate the confusing structures of Lebanese bureaucracy and aid provision. They joined forces with or gathered with a number of amazing Lebanese activists and built this movement that has multiple different projects. It has something called the Migrant Community Center. There's now 3 or 4 centers around the country. I think some of them may be struggling in the current context, but I did a lot of my research at one of these centers in Beirut where they offer classes. I taught English. It's a place, it's kind of a safe space for migrant workers to go meet each other, have birthday parties, there's daycare. And a lot of the people, they're quite visible, generally speaking, in at least some parts of Lebanese society, specifically some neighborhoods of Beirut, but not only in the capital city, including in other cities. And many of the migrant workers I met were conscious of these efforts, would say things like, not all Lebanese, that there is this horrible experience that we generally have of Lebanese society, but we are also grateful to meet certain Lebanese individuals, or not just Lebanese, but you have foreigners, you have Syrians and Palestinians involved. I think there isn't a lack of awareness, and I would say even a kind of immense generosity among migrant worker communities to this kind of activism. And in terms of your point about queer feminists, yeah, so a lot of the Lebanese activists were people who have an amazing history of being connected to feminist and queer organizing, working on domestic violence, reproductive health, gender inclusive social spaces. Like, these were the people that really came together, and they're still doing that incredible work. And after the arrival of over 1 million Syrian refugees around 2015, there was a link made between kinds of racism and targeting directed at migrant workers and at Syrians. You had these, like, a lot of neighborhoods would have curfews for Syrians that were a form of targeting. So these connections are being made. The thing I would say is that, unfortunately, as we know about activism in any context, they're not representative of Lebanese society as a whole, and they certainly haven't made the kind of inroads to mass social transformation that we would need to see to really change the kafala system. It's so structurally embedded, it's so pervasive, that even in contexts where people feel that they're doing their best, they treat the domestic worker and their family very well, there is a kind of inextricability between certain social relations, like the idea that to have a functional family, in order to be able to be a good husband who provides for your wife, or be a good child who provides for your parents, you need to have a domestic worker. These are deeply embedded kind of social truths. And so I think even the presence of consciousness raising around mistreatment, that doesn't come close to countering the structural significance of the kafala system in Lebanese society. And there's actually an amazing recent film by Lebanese filmmaker Maher Abi Samra. It's called Makhdoumin, in English, A Maid for Each. It came out a few years ago, I think 2018, and it looks at exactly this. It looks at the role of the kafala system as a kind of public secret in Lebanese society. Like, we can't live without it. That's the idea. I think I missed your first question, perhaps. There was a solidarity part and the first part.
Well, about what wider Lebanese society, but I mean, that is kind of an impossible question, because there are so many different narratives.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we have also a comment question, so maybe get to that. So this is a comment or question from a colleague here at Brown, Professor Andre Willis. Hello, Andre. Thank you, Professor Kassamali. Given your acknowledgement that the genealogy of the Black-White binary is intimately tied to the particular barbarism and legalized brutality of the transatlantic slave trade, why attempt to deploy Black as a modifier to Beirut? It seems like the racialized hierarchies in Beirut that you want to discuss might be better served, and the American movement for Black lives better preserved, by deploying a term that addresses the complicated context in Lebanon in more robust, descriptive ways that avoid the problems that the Black-White binary invokes.
Yeah, so the question is referring to something that I didn't have time to get into, but my work in most of my fieldwork was done with undocumented workers who are referred to as freelance workers. And I look at this intersection that was happening in the time I was there between 2014 to 16 among mostly Ethiopian, but generally migrant domestic workers who leave the home. So they flee these incarcerated spaces of domestic servitude and work in the city. So they are undocumented workers who have transformed one specific neighborhood, but generally multiple parts of multiple neighborhoods in Beirut, where you have things like hair salons, coffee shops, secret spaces where you can hang out, nightclubs. There's a whole kind of informal, semi-underground infrastructure, what I think of as a layer to the city of Beirut for migrant workers, and many of them have either Syrian boyfriends or Lebanese allies. In order to open a business, for example, you do need a Lebanese partner. You can't just do it yourself if you're a foreigner. And so it's a set of partnerships, intimate, financial, sexual, political, that have created this layer to the city, and I refer to it as Black Beirut. And I don't think of it as premised on a binary of Black or white, but I think of the category of Blackness through a lot of the conceptual work that has been done recently, thinking about the relationship between Blackness as both, again, as I said, a proximity to social vulnerability, a specific, historically rooted vulnerability to death, to use that term, but also a form of fugitivity and escape, and a kind of creative engagement with the possibilities of freedom. And so, you know, a lot of this work, again, in the North American context, but not exclusively, has been asking us, what would it mean to think conceptually, not abstractly, but conceptually, about Blackness, and what happens if we start from the Black experience as opposed to starting from a white experience and then thinking about the mistreatment of Black bodies or other minorities, etc. And so for me, the work of Fred Moten, for example, and the relationship between Blackness and fugitivity became a very helpful way to think through what I was seeing in these spaces of Beirut. And just to clarify, it's not only an abstract application. These are dominated by Ethiopian and many other African, East, West African countries, people from those countries of origin. And so Blackness is not a metaphor, it is a lived reality. It's a thing that people talk about, but I also think that it offers an opening to precisely talk about this. You know, the category of Sri Lankia is so delimited by the constraints of the kafala system, but in a nightclub playing Amharic music and the latest hits from Nigeria, like Naija Pop, for example, that everyone goes to dance to on Saturday nights, the life that's made possible in that space is not the life determined by the category of Sri Lankia for me. It's a very different kind of creativity. It's a different kind of possibility. And so Black Beirut has become the way that I'm trying to think through that, which exists obviously in productive tension with whiteness as a form of proximity to social power. So not whiteness as in Lebanese are racially white, but whiteness as something that, again, has this complex local manifestation that is not separate from shade of skin, but has, again, specificity. I know that's a somewhat convoluted answer, but that's my attempt to think through why I use that term.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like I'm probably so responsible for having used those terms, and I think it's good to think and reflect more while we are starting to finally think more critically and reflectively and actually analyze questions of race and racialization, anti-Black racism in the Middle East, to do that while learning from the experience and the work that has been done in North America, without any way, I guess, generalizing, taking away, diminishing, and also, of course, appreciating the specificities, both in terms of, obviously, the transatlantic slave trade, and then, I guess, in relation to the Middle East. And as you said previously, I mean, that is still a very unexplored area, especially in terms of the history of racialization, anti-Black racism. Sumayya, we now have several questions, but we have run out of time. So my apologies to the audience. Thanks so much, Sumayya, for making the time and for generously sharing your work. Very exciting and important work. Thank you to the audience who's joining us here on webinar, but also on YouTube. And yes, my apologies that we didn't get to the questions. And yes, bye-bye, everyone. And thank you again, Sumayya.
Thank you. And yeah, sorry also for those questions that were unanswered. feel free to email me.